Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy on a hot summer day to be joined by Josh Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back, Josh. It's been a while since you've been in the chair.
Yeah, well, it's nice. It's nice to be back. I mean, it's one of these things where we do this every week, and sometimes it feels like, oh boy,
got to drag myself into the studio.
But that's why it's nice to take a break every once in a while and realize how much you enjoy it.
Well, that's the spirit. Yeah, we had a July break, and I want to thank Lauren McGaughy for joining me last week. We had a great talk about the Paxton case, and if you were off on summer break yourself and you missed that, we had Lauren McGaughy of the Dallas Morning News last week had a really good kind of a deep chat we got a couple of good jokes in it even about Paxton. Heard from a listener about a funny comment Lauren made. So that's a little teaser. Get in there. There's a lot we could talk about today in both state and national politics. There was it's good that we're back in August. I mean, it's been a thing. It's one of those weird media trope discussions. I don't know. You don't tune into the same kind of things I do necessarily. There's been this kind of little sub thing among media people about like, oh, it's a quiet August. And people go, oh, you're an idiot. It's never quiet in August, but whatever our expectations should have been, it is not a quiet August.
I think it is usually quiet in August.
Well,
I agree with that perspective. This has not been a quiet August, though.
Yes. And this discussion is all like the Friday Newsday discussion, right? I mean, there's a generational, and then there's the actual empirical record, which I don't know that anybody's really gone and looked at. Some of the Friday stuff I think people have. Sure. Be that as it may, there is a lot going on right now. So, we thought today we would start by revisiting one of our frequent topics, but it's frequent for a reason. And look at some of the developments on the Texas-Mexico border this summer and Texas policy on the border.
Policy and politics.
I'm saying that we've talked about it a lot, since I think the last time we talked about it has actually been a few months. I actually went back and looked and, it comes up unexpectedly all the time. But I think the last time we really focused on kind of border policy was early May as it was kind of kicking up again in the legislature. I think then we talked about how amidst the divisive session, there was some effort to use border policy to kind of attempt to rebond Republicans. It didn't really work all that well, but that's what we were talking about that time. But we've seen since that time, another series of pretty serious developments that I think invite some degree of consideration, getting a lot of media attention.
National media attention.
Yeah, and which in itself is a topic I think.
Right, sure.
The biggest, most headline grabbing development, Greg Abbott's deployment of more resources, but particularly the deployment of these buoys in the Rio Grande River that are meant to deter migrants, and it's triggered both a lot of coverage, as we've said, and an uptick in the, perpetual conflict-laden dynamic to some degree, and we'll talk about that, between Texas and the federal government, and not to mention increased friction with the Mexican national government.
Right.
The big stories that have come out of this, sometimes brutal enforcement from DPS officers that has actually gotten some kind of, informal whistleblowing and blowback from inside the Texas DPS, Department of Public Safety, if you're listening out of state, and welcome if you are. And at least a couple of deaths that were related to the deployment of the buoys. So, and, we had this instance, we were writing some poll questions related to this policy, and you found that photograph that illustrated, we had, this is, another, slight glimpse behind the scenes where we're talking about, how dangerous are the buoys themselves. There was all the talk at the time, a lot of talk about razor wire on the border. Is the razor wire on the buoys?
It's like and we decide, well, the razor wire is not on the buoys. And then right after we had kind of decided that, got into some question wording, then I think it was Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia, I believe, sort of took a video from her trip to the border, and you can see, you look at the buoys and you're like, are those saw blades?
So the buoys have saw blades in between.
Yeah, Mad Max Thunderdome style.
Right.
I mean, so there that was.
I'm struggling for the adjective to put in front of the engineering feat there. There's a lot of one could have. I'll keep going. So, we talked a lot about the public opinion dynamics, and we don't need to recap too much, although I kind of want to attack that from a different angle, I think, than we've attacked it before. By almost any measure, save one or two things, and we'll get to that, Texas Republicans, both elites and voters, tend to unite around aggressive border enforcement actions. And as again, in stark political terms, as an added benefit for Republican incumbents, it tends to split Democratic attitudes. And by split, I don't mean evenly, but Democratic attitudes on a lot of these border policies not homogenous.
Yeah, you call this kind of a classic wedge issue, right? Because what you get is 100% of your voters, and then you drive a wedge between some share of the Democrats and the majority of Democrats who don't approve of this. But ultimately, if you're peeling off, let's say 1 in 10, 1 in 5, 1 in 3 Democrats, that's a very good issue in this kind of environment, in this kind of political competitive environment.
Right. And some of the data that we pulled to, to think about in the angle I said that's a little bit different is, we talk a lot about, the breathtaking consistency in the salience readings of this for Republicans and the difference with Democrats, where that dynamic to some degree is evident. Right. Broad attitudes on immigrants, both legal and illegal, et cetera. But, in the last poll we did in June of this year, we returned to some more specific questions that are a little bit closer to current policy being pursued in Texas. Right. And so we've asked a lot about spending, and the spending. I think the spending numbers are kind of one of the best things here. Right.
The spending stuff is really interesting. I mean, and a lot of times, we sort of inherently, at least in our own minds, we sort of ask a spending question in Texas. We're always sort of thinking about, the classic kind of fiscal conservatism as sort of, something as a point of comparison, right? To the extent that, Republicans generally, as well as in Texas, have always sort of highlighted the importance of, controlling government spending, small government, especially in Texas, we think about low taxes, low services model. And when we asked, again, during the legislative session, both at the beginning of the legislative session, at the end, at the beginning, we asked about spending in a lot of areas. And what you tend to find is that, Republican support for more spending across a broad range of issues tends to be relatively limited. But when we talk about the border, where the state has continued to spend, increasingly large amounts of state resources, in the name of border security, no matter when we ask, we actually tend to find the share of Republicans saying the state is spending too little is actually slightly upticking, if not remaining sort of constant, around 60%, which is so the majority of Republicans. Only 12% in our last poll in June said that the state is spending too much on border security, even though, again, you look at the state spending on border security, it's gone up dramatically.
Right.
But again, one interpretation of this is, there's two, I think, ways one could interpret this, and they're not mutually exclusive, right? One is to say, on the one hand, there is greater appetite for more, right? That this is actually, the majority of Republican voters saying, not only are you not spending enough, you could be doing more. And again, spending is a rough measure. I think the idea is just about effort, about resources more broadly, right? And then the other side of it would be to say, well, you're not doing a good enough job. You should be doing more,
well,
right?
Before you move on to the other measure, I also want to say and that spending, and on the spending piece, you actually see the Democratic dynamic at work too.
Exactly.
Right? That, when we ask people, are you spending too much, too little, or about the right amount on border security? Sure, 44%, but that's kind of a glass half empty of Democrats say, you're spending too much, and that looks, when you just look at the bar graph of that looks about right because Democrats and Republicans are really different. But more than a fifth, 22% say that the state is spending about the right amount, and then another 20% say the state is spending too little. Not trivial.
Yeah, it's not trivial. Well, and this is one of the big, this is one of the big issues. We're going to go a different direction, but I'll pause here for a second. This is one of the big issues for Democrats. I think one of the interesting things looking forward to the next election cycle is looking at sort of how the Democratic candidates, especially for running for Senate, against Ted Cruz, how they position themselves on the immigration issue and on border security in particular. And I think, even right now, looking at sort of the two kind of leading candidates, Colin Allred and Senator Gutierrez, you do see, some pretty distinct positions there that you don't really see on a lot of the other issues. If you were to say, how are they different on guns? You say, it's not that different. Climate, not that different. But when you look at this issue of border and this question of sort of how aggressively, there should be represented, there actually is a pretty clear division between those two candidates, which I think in and of itself is very interesting and is reflected in these numbers. But that's not really what we're here to talk about per se. We're here to talk more about, again, the governing coalition.
I suspect we'll have a lot of opportunity to talk about that race.
I think we'll have more time to talk about that, yeah, for sure. So then the other piece of this that I think is interesting is, in that same June poll, we also asked, basically whether or not voters approved or disapproved of how state leaders and the legislature had handled a number of different areas, including immigration and border security in Texas. And here, what you find is again, not surprisingly, you've got 45% of Democrats disapproving strongly. That's not to be, that's just not surprising. Among Republicans, you end up finding majority approval, 62% approve of the job that state leaders and legislature have done. But what's interesting, this is what we want to dive into for a second. Only 23% approve strongly, 39% approve somewhat.
Right.
And, how exactly to interpret that, I think, is a little bit complicated, right? I look at something like that, and part of it, I think, is we could put this into a pattern that we generally see. When we ask about approval numbers, what we tend to find is we tend to find, let's just say we're talking about a candidate or a politician. Let's just say we're talking about a generic Republican politician that people have an attitude of. And I think this is kind of a similar dynamic here. You tend to find that, let's say you have a Republican statewide official like the governor, right? And what you'll tend to see is that Democrats will express a lot of strong disapproval. And Republicans will be mixed between approving strongly and approving somewhat. Now you flip it around and say, well, what about President Biden? And you'll see a ton of strong disapproval among Republicans. Among Democrats, you see sort of a mix of strong approval and somewhat approving, right? And so to some extent, this is just the nature of something that we talk about a lot. We talk about negative partisanship a lot in here. But to the extent that, these sort of negative attitudes define our politics a lot. You could say that that's what's maybe going on here, is that, as much as, when you look at these attitudes, this is as much about the fact that, partisanship is defined by what Democrats aren't willing to do for Republicans as it is about what Republicans want. There's a flip side to another interpretation we could take at this too. And I think, and it's not unreasonable in the state, in the case of immigration and border security, which is to say that, yeah, Republicans approve, but maybe there's, again, there's two interpretations, but maybe they think more could be done.
At least. Yeah.
Well, I can say this too.
But no, I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, I think, if you're listening to this, you might say, well, of course, only 39% of Republicans, or let's say, of course, more Republicans approve somewhat than approve strongly. You could say because these policies on the border are so divisive. That could be your position. You could say, once you start putting barbed wire on the border and these, these sort of quasi whistleblowers in DPS saying, well, they're telling us not to give them water or push. Maybe some Republicans are taking a step back and saying, maybe we could be doing this in a more humane way. But the problem is there's no evidence anywhere else in the existing data when we look at specific policies.
And in fact, the existing data points in the other direction.
Right, which is they seem to
if you just look at the data we just talked, the other item we just talked about, if that's the case, then you would think that there would be more Republicans saying we're spending too much or we should slow down on spending on the border. And that's not what we're getting. 60% of Republicans say we're spending too little.
And furthermore, across many, many years of polling on various, sort of policies aimed at the border, whether by the state or by the federal government, what we tend to find is that, I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 80% of Republicans regularly express approval or support for really any range of punitive policies that might be seen as deterring immigration. I would say illegal immigration, but I'm actually going to say deterring immigration, full stop.
Period.
Or, essentially seeking to essentially expel people here illegally. And so,
we ask people straightforwardly pretty regularly,
Yeah.
do you think people that are in the country illegally should be deported immediately? And we get the kind of numbers you're talking about.
Exactly. And so I think, interpreting this, it would seem to me that given that the state is so, so clear in its policy. I mean, this is I have to take a step back just to say this, I think, the right way. A lot of times government does stuff that's just not clear to people. I'll give you an example, right? To the extent that the legislature did a lot of work to shore up the electric grid, if we went out and started talking to voters about what they did, it would be news to them. They would not know about it. It would be difficult to understand. And that's true for most policy areas. But the border policy that the state is engaged in has been so public and so blunt and so overtly political. And I don't say that in a negative way if you've listened to this podcast before, but it's been packaged in a way so as to appeal to the Republican electorate. At this point, there's no way to interpret this, to my mind, other than to say, there's more appetite in the Republican electorate for these sort of border policies, despite the negative coverage, despite questions about sovereignty, despite the continued and increasing cost of it. And so given that, where does that lead us?
And, and the piece of, to point out, we often, try to occasionally put some pointers. I mean, John Moritz in the Corpus Christi Caller-Times had a very interesting story about this that's getting some play today. I think it was published yesterday that, an international commission that oversees the Rio Grande River found that the buoys are actually on the Mexican side of the river.
Yeah, and and it's sort of like, is that a problem in terms of internal Texas politics?
No.
Nope. I don't think so. That's not going to change people's fundamental views on this.
Yeah, no, I think it underlines and so that kind of brings us to the politics of all of this.
Right.
And let's talk about that for a few minutes. You kind of walked us right up to that. And the politics of this in particular for Governor Abbott, who, for better or for worse, or I think unambiguously is and purposefully is the face of this policy and seen as the agent of these policies on the border. And again, it was interesting to think back to how we talked about this in May, and how we saw the politics of this, or at least playing out or not playing out in the legislature. But, this serves, put it this way, this serves to, divert media attention from other less pleasant stories for Republican governance and Republican elected officials in Texas. It's stories that are either unpleasant or simply not as good. I think the economic story has gotten a little more mixed in the state, not because, you can email me if you want, but not because the economy is in the tank in the state. If you look at the economic stories in the state right now, the ones that are not driven by efforts, to point reporters in certain directions. If you were to let the economic story in the state sort of settle to its natural point, you'd still have stories about people who are coming to Texas a lot. But the big story would be housing costs.
The unaffordability. It'd just be unaffordability. And the thing is, and part of it is, look, this is not a Texas-specific story, but it's Texas-sized because of, Texas's major metropolitan areas on the one hand where, through the housing costs are really sort of, so problematic, but also Texas's population, which is young and diverse, and also, in a lot of cases, in a lot of places, relatively low income. And so there's a higher pressure point on that. I think how, Texas has, one of the most restrictive abortion, laws in the country right now, which is not done well at the ballot box when it's actually been put to a vote. And public opinion here reflects public opinion in most other places. So there's that piece of it.
On that issue, yeah.
On that issue, there's gun violence. There's the school safety concerns, even though, again, we're very likely to go into a special session about vouchers when that
and even the grid, in which, elected officials can stand up and say, we did something about the grid, but our numbers have shown, and we'll have to, we'll check back into this, but even after the session, that, people are not persuaded necessarily in their gut expectations, their reflexive expectations that this is not something they should still be worried about. And, the heat wave doesn't help that.
Yeah, and then you might say like, oh, you're just going down a laundry list of these things, whatever. It's like, yeah, I understand that. But the thing that's interesting about the border, and to bring it back to that, is that, this isn't an obvious conclusion, like this isn't an obvious next step.
Right.
Right. I mean, these are very clear decisions to escalate the degree of conflict, both with the federal government, but also, honestly, with, maybe with
whatever fight they can pick. I mean, look, the busing is the good example of this. I mean, the busing has clearly, contributed to big problems in New York City. Mm-hmm. It's actually caused a pretty big headache for the mayor of New York City,
right?
Who, there's a good piece in, slight Eric Adams, diversion. There's a good piece in the New Yorker that's kind of like, can Eric Adams get by on charm and bluster alone? And this has been out. I'm not close enough to that to make a judgment on whether that's a fair story or not.
But it
underlines the fact that, here, let me just make some problems for other people that are for Democrats.
No, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, I think, to the extent that the busing policy, when it first started was, which I gotta say, overwhelmingly supported by Texas Republicans.
Yeah.
And, again, not
an
insignificant share of Democrats.
Yeah.
And to the extent that that started off, I think with what I think is fair, a self-evident argument that this was a political ploy. But the reality is that there's been no punishment for it. If anything, there's been benefit to it. So, I mean, if you want to say what was the lesson of the busing policy and how has it, informed the current moment, it's that, expanding the scope of conflict and finding more, again, Democratic actors to see as, essentially not serious about the border. And, again, elevating the conflict beyond, sort of Texas media and Texas politics to Democratic cities, national media. It hasn't hurt the governor. And if anything, it probably helps him with his voters. And so, so to the extent you say, you go from a policy of, well, we'll put up some shipping containers, so there's kind of a physical barrier over here, to, okay, now we're just going to start, busing people to Democratic cities, to, okay, well, what if we put barbed wire out?
How about buoys with some saw blades?
Yeah, I mean, and to the extent that you say, well, someone in some conversation at some point said, that's probably gonna be controversial, and I think someone else in that conversation said, yeah, so
exactly.
What?
Yeah, if not, so what? Even beyond that, it's like,
great,
yeah, good idea, yeah,
that it will be controversial.
I like it, So, and again, I don't want to be too flip about this, but I think that the busing is a good example of, to my mind, I mean, and I think we've talked about this on here, but to kind of use it as a transition to another point. The busing turned out to be, I think, a lot more complicated than a lot of people's first impressions, especially progressive and people on the left. The interesting thing is, he's forcing people to get on buses. Now,
they're not.
There are cases, and there are cases where people were, promises were made that were not kept. People were kind of either pressured or a certain amount of the hustle, and obviously there's some legal action around that. But stepping back, there were plenty of Democrats, including mayors in the border area and some of the reps, saying, great, if you would just do this a little better. Yeah. We're already, trying to help transfer people out of our cities, because if we don't, they don't want, they didn't cross the border to stay in El Paso or name your city. They are trying to get to somewhere else. And there is a humanitarian argument for one, even within the legal rubric of processing migrants, for helping people get to where they have family members, contacts, sponsors in other parts of the country.
I think we talked about this the first time.
We did.
He said specifically, you could make an argument that a Democrat and even a progressive Democrat who hadn't really heard much about this might say, oh, good.
Right. Well, and I think there was, and I think you and I've and maybe even on the podcast, we speculated about how some of the Democratic support for this is potentially people going, oh, they think these guys think they're hurting these people, but they're actually helping some of them. So, well, and look, just shows how out to lunch they are or whatever.
Well, to your point,
a lot of mental gymnastics there, but I think they're there for some people.
Well, to your point, I think something that's, a key, feature of Texas that, I think people may or may not, there's varied degrees of incorporation of this, but it's a very varied and diverse place. If you're a Democratic voter, a consistent Democratic voter living in Del Rio, or another, let's say Eagle Pass or wherever, you're looking around and thinking, okay, like this is a pretty small place. What do we do with all these migrants? And they don't have the social services to deal with it. A lot of people don't appreciate the diversity of Texas, in which, you're going to have a lot of Democrats living in border communities who do see, the social resources available, they're strained
Right.
in some way. And so, there's a lot of reasons, to see this as being, again, progressive or liberal people might support this policy. But the key here, I think, in a lot of ways is that, the conflict that was produced out of the policy really has probably broken the governor's way. I mean, in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I don't think that anybody would looking back at the politics of this, and this is what we look at as the politics of this, and now we have hindsight, at no point has the other shoe dropped. Look, and I'll say this. A child died on a bus being taken to Chicago this week. So I don't want to discount the humanitarian, I was just in general, there are serious humanitarian issues across all these policies that we're not talking about because we're talking about the politics of it.
Right.
And we'll get to some of the humanitarian issues maybe, in a second. But, setting that aside for a second, the other shoe has not dropped for the governor. If anything, the more strain that he puts on Chicago, on New York, on LA, really, it fits into the brand that he's cultivating of, essentially, this kind of warrior, in some ways, standing at the border saying, no, stop. What, Yeah,
and look, in a sense, I mean, it has put, you've seen different responses from different big city mayors, kind of depending on their own political positioning. Largely Democrats, but we were talking about Eric Adams earlier. I mean, Eric Adams was, did kind of say, hey, Biden administration could be doing more about this.
Well, and the thing,
we're kind of catching this all, and that's, to me, it's a fair bit of politics.
I would say that's a really important shift in the national, let's just say in the broad political discussion that, I think should be noted, and we'll note it right here for the first time. But you are seeing more Democrats come out and say, "Hey, we need to be more serious about this."
Yeah.
And I said this to you, going back to referencing ourselves. But I said this about O'Rourke's.
If I may quote myself,
you can go back But I said this about O'Rourke, in the Abbott campaign, is that to a large extent, what I thought was one of the major, failures of that campaign was not having a clear statement of what the Democratic border policy would look like, and ceding that.
And that's been a common criticism of
and I think
and look, the Biden administration, I think, heard that and responded.
Yeah, no, look, and I think the Biden administration has kind of been whipsawed around both because of the politics of it, but also sort of, the various court decisions that have kind of put them in a difficult position because they have, they haven't been able to have a consistent border policy over this first term because, what is and is not allowable is sort of been changing, throughout the course of a few years. And so that's tricky. And
to pivot a little bit back, to your previous point and to turn it a little bit, or, when you're in that position, you face the fact that in this political environment, and probably generally, it's a lot easier for people to, focus on a negative response than a positive one.
Right. Yeah, it's usually easier to focus on the negative response. And so that's the thing. So, part of this is, what's interesting about this, generally is you can sort of see as we start to lay this out, there are just sort of multiple avenues along which, Abbott is gaining politically from being ever more, let's just say, out front of this particular political conflict. And we said this before. I don't think, Abbott's not running for president. I don't expect him to run for president anytime soon. I'm not sure I expect him to run for president ever. But no politician basically jettisons a good opportunity to put themselves at the center of a big conversation in a policy area where they feel advantaged.
Yeah, and where, and that advantage is not only political in Abbott's place, just to flag and to be, who we are. It's also the institutional piece, right? Mm-hmm. When Abbott is out front on the border, everyone else is behind him.
Yes.
This is not an issue where the lieutenant governor can very easily step out and go, well, I matter, et cetera, which he does. And, so, it makes it another in that kind of political sense. And we've talked about those dynamics a lot. So before we move off of this, let's go ahead and kind of round out. So we've talked about all the assets, but we've also raised that, when you talk about the politics, it's easy for the human dimension and humanitarian issues here to fall by the wayside. We've mentioned that people have lost their lives trying to navigate the buoys. We had, a child fall ill on a bus and die in the last week, or at least the story ran in the last week. I'm not sure what the turnaround time on finding out about that was. And it does raise the issue that we've raised before, is that like most things, the political well here is not bottomless.
Right.
Or to switch metaphors, you can, these policies have in the past enjoyed broad support, but then drifted or, either drifted or, gone in directions that bumped into limits, and they usually do involve children.
Yeah, I mean, look, as good as the politics of this are in the way that we've laid it out, you get a 3-4-year-old child caught up in some barbed wire, and a media crew shows up and where they're trying to rip this kid from the barbed wire, you've got a problem. Full stop. It doesn't matter what the kid's nationality is. It doesn't matter why he or she came here. That is bad optics, right?
Yeah.
And and the thing is, and the state is, really like,
and it's bad optics because, I just want to add to that, to pursue the, the kind of point you were making earlier. It's bad optics because the optics can't outweigh, the optics, bring up something, kind of peels away the politics, right? Because it's such a visceral human thing.
Well, it's like when you say, when people were criticizing the busing and they said, this is a political stunt and, this is like a humanitarian issue because you're basically forcing people, into the interior of the country who may or may not want to go there. And that's all very theoretical. And ultimately, I think, time has sort of shown and, maybe, maybe not. Maybe some people didn't want to get on the bus, but for a lot of people, they do want to go somewhere not like Brownsville. They want to go somewhere else. They have family somewhere else, etc. There's no counter narrative to a child wrapped up in barbed wire.
Yeah.
There's no way to say that this is not a humanitarian thing. This is border policy, because this is the other issue. It's not really border policy. It's the state's policy, and it's Governor Abbott's policy.
Yeah.
And so that becomes, I think it opens the possibility for many problems. And I think, you mentioned a couple times, this sort of, and it's, some migrants who've died getting wrapped up in the buoys, and even that's sort of a little bit like, well, is that what happened? Did they die upriver and then they were swept into the buoys? But it's interesting to me, and I'll just be snarky here for a minute because I feel like it. But to the extent that DPS director Steve McCraw comes out and says, "Oh no, they definitely died upriver." Well, you know what? Who I don't trust in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy?
Yeah. Yeah,
the person who went to the Texas Senate after Uvalde and basically towed the company line that was found to be completely inaccurate about what happened that day. And I think, again, I'm reluctant to say it, but I will. The fact is, on that day, he really showed his ass because he went out there, he towed the political line of the story that was sort of concocted as to what happened, and he kind of showed that he is a political actor like everybody else. And so the fact is that, DPS and their role in this and what they're saying is going on, it can't really be 100% trusted at this point. And that's sort of the environment we're
particularly
in.
When you got, as we made reference to, some clear kind of, reservations among the rank and file about the
policies, whether written or unwritten, as to how they're dealing with this. And that's the other thing too, is, DPS is not a border patrol unit. That's not what these guys signed up for. That's not what their primary job is. And to the extent that you're putting them into greater contact in more conflictual situations with larger number of migrants, you are going to have more issues. And ultimately, at this point, Abbott's basic response to these things is to say, well, we wouldn't have to do this if not for the federal government. But to the extent that you're putting saw blades on buoys, well, you don't have to do that.
Right.
We haven't been doing that. Nobody's done that. That's not something that's been part of, policy. So that argument becomes a little bit problematic at some point. And again, I think that the optics and the visceral nature of the kinds of things that are going to happen, they do, again, I'm not going to say it's going to change them, but it creates an exposure, a lot of negative exposure potentially.
So with that, I think, I'm not going to try to struggle for a manufactured transition here. We'll be, this story, obviously.
The story will develop itself.
We will talk about again, and we'll, continue, moves back into a central position, It never gets very far, but it is fair to, for the, much of the session, we kind of commented, we weren't talking about border security a lot. And it does do that. It goes into abeyance, at least in the public attention, but it's always there to sort of be drawn on. But before we go, I do, it would feel a little like malpractice to not at least flag what, everyone else is, sort of noticing, which is that, the long-awaited, sort of fourth set of Donald Trump indictments in Georgia, were finally, were filed and made public, and came out this week in the last few days as we record this on Wednesday. We don't need to really do much about the things themselves. If you have any exposure to media, you
if you
can
listen
read
to this, you probably know what's
kind
going
of
on.
a lot about it. But there was, it was a very convenient roundup by Priscilla Aguirre in My Essay, the My San Antonio website. And one of the what they did was, what I kind of want to just touch on, which is that they the writer rounded up social media and quoted responses from Republicans to this latest set of Trump indictments. And so you saw very familiar patterns. Which is, kind of one of the central, at least national political issues for Republicans at this moment, in terms of particularly of Republicans that will be on the ballot in 2024, which is how do you manage that? And what we saw, among Texas Republicans, not surprisingly, that is among the major responses that we saw, people were supportive of Trump. The My Essay story has tweets from Lance Gooden, Ronnie Jackson, Ted Cruz, all pro-Trump and echoing, familiar messaging, weaponization of the Justice Department, etc. But then it's still signs of people that are trying to take a slightly different path. Now, these people are much lonelier. And, for example, Will Hurd was kind of took the tact in the material that I saw that, Trump's troubles ensure another Biden victory.
I think Chip Roy has kind of taken that approach. I think he's
and I didn't see much by Chip Roy, and it puts Chip Roy in a little bit of an awkward position because Chip Roy is also a major advocate of the weaponization argument,
right?
Just not so much in the defense of Trump necessarily. And I just haven't. If you saw, I just haven't seen what Congressman Roy has had to say. I'm making a note to go look that up, actually, because I'm just curious about that. From the kind of work that we do, it raises the eternal question, and this is obviously a big question in the national media. Will anything move Trump's numbers in a way that are significant? And before we came on, I want to kind of explore maybe a slightly different argument than what we see out there, because much of the media coverage, especially in the last few weeks nationally, to get into our bailiwick, and we didn't really talk about this beforehand, but there was a New York Times Siena poll that got a huge amount of play, and to my mind was an exercise in something, we talk about on here a lot as a particular point you like to make, which is the overinterpretation of data, which showed, the national race, Biden with either a very narrow margin or it essentially tied, and people's kind of, their hair on fire, kind of, like Trump could win, and Trump is like completely, and obviously that poll means very little at this point.
I would say it means nothing.
Right.
I mean, the only thing I'd say is, the only thing that you get out of that poll, and this is not a criticism of the poll generally, but just that result.
And that's not to say the poll is quote unquote wrong.
No, there's good stuff in that poll, but I mean the main point here is that the only sort of thing you're comparing it against is expectations.
Right.
The expectation is that a bunch of people, whether Republicans or others, who formerly were fine with the former president's conduct or whatever, now all of a sudden have decided no, and then this is too far, and then you find in the data this wellspring. There's a couple points I kind of want to make about this.
Yeah, do it.
And so let me just do this a couple ways. So the first is
do it.
One thing is when we talk about some of these, I'll go in a reverse order. Something else I'm thinking about as you're talking about it, is that social science is and polling is a social science tool. Okay, and I would say this, it's not great at finding small differences, right? And so if the goal is to say like, hey, I want to know if support for Trump is 51% or 20%, I can tell you that. I can tell you with confidence whether it's closer to one or the other, whether it's significantly more than 20%. If you say to me, well, is Trump's support 48% or 45%? I say, well, that's going to get a little bit tricky, right? Yeah. And not only is it going to get tricky, it would get tricky if we were a week before the election. Trickier still over a year out.
Yeah.
Right, when we don't know what the electorate looks like. But honestly, like that's kind of what we're talking about here. I mean, I think one of the things, there's this, I mean, to go back to where you started on this section, or not on this section, but on this discussion, this piece of it is like, nothing's really seemed to move Trump's numbers in the past, will anything. And the question becomes, move and move how much? And there's like the mechanisms of movement, which are interesting, and we'll talk about for a second here. But then there's also the consequence of it. So when you think about the mechanisms, I think one of the questions that we're kind of looking at here is, and I think what pollsters are thinking is, okay, well, one, you stack these indictments up on top of each other. Does the accumulation, setting aside the specific effects, but the accumulation of multiple indictments, multiple different courts, multiple different investigations, does that accumulation lead to some kind of decline in evaluation of Trump for whatever reason, whether his conduct or his electability? It doesn't even matter.
Fatigue, whatever.
And that's another question you could ask even after that. So the accumulation may have done something, and you may say, well, how? Right? Is it because, again, people think worse of him? Is it because they just think he's not electable, but they love him? Who knows?
They've seized on different alternatives.
Another possibility that we might think about is, we'll do the different investigations and indictment. Do they have different weight? Do some people see, let's say, well, yeah, he gave Stormy, they gave Stormy Daniels some money, but that doesn't matter.
Yawn.
But like, everybody takes documents. But trying to
everybody pays off their stripper lovers.
It happens. Sorry. But then maybe some voters would say, yeah, but the conspiracy charges are a problem, or something, right?
Right.
Maybe not. Maybe they all look the same. Maybe, among Republicans, they're all political charges, and maybe among Democrats, they're all serious, and you kind of say that's a wash. Those are all mechanistic, and they're interesting, whatever. But like if we just take it, now at this point you're like, oh my God, okay, great. But let's just take a step back and say, but why would it matter? Ultimately, we ask how much of an impact would these things, regardless of the mechanism, have to be to have a fundamental impact on the outcome of the next election? And I think the important part to sort of just take a step back and say, it actually probably isn't very much. We've had very close national elections, the last number of years. Both parties really, we talk about elections. I mean, I talk about elections, or some people think about elections this way, as either, sort of mobilization versus persuasion elections. It's obviously not mutually exclusive. It can be both. But generally speaking, when we look at elections in the current environment, it is generally about mobilizing one's voters first and foremost. So, if you kind of go and look at the closeness of national elections and say, look, if because of the range of indictments, whether it's the specifics of some indictments or the accumulation of them, whether it leads some Republicans and independents to either think less of Trump or think that maybe, look, it's too much of a distraction, it doesn't really matter. But if it decreases his support by, let's say, 5% among Republicans, and I'm not saying those Republicans go and vote for Biden for a second term, but maybe they just don't turn out. 3 to 5% of Republicans say, this is too much, or this is too much trouble, or I think this is a real problem.
I don't feel quite right about this.
I don't feel quite right about this. Well, in the national environment, that's about enough to lose an election.
Yeah.
It's not going to take much more than that. In fact, that might be enough on its own. And so I think, that's sort of the thing. But like to the extent that like a poll, let alone a poll a year before the election is going to...
And a national poll.
Yeah, and a national poll when, again, there's no national election. To the extent that, like, you start to think about this stuff, the reality is the tool is not going to uncover that.
Right.
Both because of, the measurement error, because of how far out we are, because we don't know what the electorate's going to look like. But also, we're trying to ascertain whether there's, a less than 5% drop in support. That's hard.
Right. And I know this is no accident. And so if you look at our numbers and you look at Trump's favorability rating, say, in the last year and a half, February 22, his favorability rating among Texas Republicans, still very strong, has gone from 80 to 76, with some fluctuation around that line, drop of 4 points. Per your point, not something you can make a lot out of, but the estimate's the estimate. And then you look at his favorability ratings among his unfavorable ratings among independents. His negative ratings among independents have gone from 49 in February of 2022 to 55 in June of 2023. Again, I'm sort of raising my hands. I mean, not nothing.
Well, I'll put it this way. Could that be random fluctuations in the data because we're sampling people?
Yes.
100%. Could that be a reflection of the fact that he keeps getting indicted for serious crimes?
And there's some subtle erosion.
Yeah, that's very possible too. And we just won't know yet. But if you think about, the teeth grinding going on among a lot of Republican elites at the moment, it's because they understand the electoral dynamics are such that, he can't lose 5% of 5% of likely Republican voters and win a national election, most likely.
Right.
And that's what they're looking at. And in the face of no viable alternative in the primary, I think there is, this actually kind of brings us back to the Texas response and the response from, the core of, you're in for, in for a penny, in for a dollar, or whatever.
Right.
In for a dime, in for whatever. I don't know.
In for a dime, in for a dollar.
In for a dime, in for a dollar. Inflation.
Well, I'm the generation where we use cash.
Yeah, that's right. I never have cash. So, but if you think about it, the teeth gnashing is going on right now. You don't really have a choice but to say this is the weaponization, this is nonsense. Because when you're talking to, you're not talking to Democrats, you're talking to Republicans, you're talking to independents. You're saying, don't take this seriously.
Right.
Because really, it doesn't take a lot of Republicans taking these charges seriously to create a serious problem in terms of the national political campaign.
Right. And to your point about the politics of this, I mentioned, that the people that, that at first cut, and again, I didn't do a comprehensive survey here, but, for every one of the people that I mentioned, a Cruz, a Gooden, a Ronnie Jackson, who took time to do this when he wasn't, MFing cops at the rodeo.
Right.
There's 5 or 10 Republicans who are just ducking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is, one of the reasons they're doing that. It's, these people are making the odds-on bet in terms of the dynamics inside the party and certainly inside the Texas Republican Party. But it's, it's not a position anybody is enjoying.
Well,
I'm positive of that, including.
Well, and the thing is, there's no clear viable alternative path. If you think about it, there's no, at this point, looking at the same set of data that's available to everybody, there's no advantage, in fact, a significant disadvantage for someone like Ted Cruz, Lance Gooden,
in stark political terms,
Ronnie Jackson going out and saying, you know what, former president's too compromised, I'm going to support Ron DeSantis.
Right.
You know what you're supporting? You're supporting the likelihood that you have a primary challenger.
Right.
That's what you're supporting at that point.
And
a vindictive former president who will support that primary challenger.
Right. Yeah. And somebody who's, clearly has been exposed as running kind of a Mickey Mouse campaign.
It would appear so. Yeah, that's good.
All right.
That's a good.
On that terrible note, I'm going to thank Josh for being here. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. We couldn't do it without you all. Thank you for listening. If you have found this podcast via the usual platforms, please try our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. If you click a couple times, go to our blog section, you'll find a post that features not only a link to this podcast, but also some graphics of some of the data we've discussed today. So again, thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.